It's really glad to see you guys here this morning. We're really glad that you can join us here for worship. If you're online, we're going to be entering into a new series on 1 Peter. And so today we're going to be entering in a conversation on Peter. And it's interesting because I don't know about you, but have you ever felt like things were like overwhelming in your life? Yeah? Like thing after thing, there's things that are happening that you can't control. There's things that are happening inside of you. And there's just like a sense of it's just tough. Life is just tough. And you enter into like dark places in your life. And you're struggling to get through. You're struggling to get by. You're struggling to get through every single day. And I don't know about you, but even the last couple of weeks was tough. I've had a tough couple of weeks myself, and I know there's other people that, here as I was sharing with the BOF, there are many of us are dealing with difficulty, challenges. Things are tough, and it's just not from one or two of you, but just even the last maybe 6 months, last year, it's been tough. And what do you do? How do you get out of it? How do you struggle through it? Is there an answer? And I loved our BOIF this Sunday this Friday because we asked this. I had a whole prepared study that I had prepared, printed it out. The twins went with me to my office. We took some selfies. They saw what manufacturing might look like. My kids weren't even with me. Okay, we printed it out, go into the study, and then I took out one of the Q&A. We do these Q&A sometimes at BYF, and it was like, how do you talk to someone who is having going through tough stuff? And so we just literally, that was the lesson. And the way I describe it, it's like, how do you live your life when you feel like you're just drowning and you have to hold your breath and you're hoping you get that next breath? You ever feel like that? And if you haven't, you might be someone that's close to you, around you, that you may not have asked that question. So we did a poll. You remember I said, have you ever gone through tough stuff with the youth? And most of them raised their hand. Do you know someone who's gone through tough stuff? Someone raised their hand, and if you don't know anything, then a couple years didn't raise your hand. Either you weren't paying attention, or you're not aware, or you're really protected. But we all will go through these seasons. We're all gonna feel like there are times where we're drowning, or we all may see someone that we love or we care about that may be drowning. And what do we do? What do we say? Do we just say, "Get through it? It'll be okay"? How do you even minister? How do you even speak? What should you say when someone's suffering, when there's suffering that's going around? And I think that there is a profoundness in the story, in the context of Peter, in 1 Peter, that will give us insight of what should we do in the midst of suffering. What should we do if we're just trying to make it through? What should we do when we're drowning and not making it through? And the way I describe it, it's kind of like when someone will share with me at work, they're like, I'm having a really tough time with my boss. And, I have an opportunity to be, like, I've been in someone who's worked, I've also been a boss. And part of that conversation, how do you deal with that? And one of my favorite lines I'll say to them is, you got to just outlast and do the right thing. Okay? The Christian word, you want to know the Christian word, is persevere. And in the context of the life of the believer, there is a lot of perseverance. Endure. But I use the word outlast. And I say just outlast, because if you do the right thing, you say the right thing, you do the right, God will work Himself out. You just outlast the badness or the selfishness or the greediness. Just outlast. How do you outlast in the context of other things, though? How do you outlast when there's something deep inside you that's broken? How do you outlast? How do you outlast everything? And so there's a part of me that says, I actually think that maybe I was a little bit wrong. I mean, it's true to persevere, but there is something that's more and beyond the outlasting that we have in 1 Peter. And so what I want to do is I'm going to give what I call the trailer, a glimpse of what we will journey to, where Pastor Chan and Michael will help lead us in this also in the preaching as we share the load on 1 Peter over the next few months. I'm excited to go to more of this, going straight to the text. We haven't done expository preaching in a while here because we used to have Bible studies, but now we're all doing different things. So we're going to spend time in God's Word, okay? And not that we don't, but verse by, we're going to be together in this journey. And in this context, I want you to understand where we're landing, this idea of this hope, this new family identity that comes. That you have there's in the midst of suffering, how do you get through? There is a hope that has to remain. Because the one thing that is very difficult in the midst of suffering is when you lose hope. You kind of know this until you know this. But when hope is gone, you give up. You give up on life. You give up on the job. You give up on your spouse. You give up on you don't give up on your kids. But you give up on whatever you want to give up to. You give up on your parents. You give up hope. You give up on your church. You give up on your small group. You give up on your community. You give up on your pastor. Hope. What is that hope? What do I believe? And there is an aspect that hope comes in the context of a new identity, in the context of new family, a newness of that. There's a context where there is the fact of that suffering that we go through has in and of itself, there are suffering that happens in 1 Peter that's more in the context of what's happening outside to them. Something they can't control. And we'll come to that, some of the stuff that you're like, well, I do something self-inflicted suffering, which happens. But that suffering context actually has its own work. Here in this passage, we're having things outside forces are causing this suffering, and how do they get through it? It's one thing when you cause yourself, and you're like, I messed this up myself, and I did this. It's another thing when something happened in your life where you didn't cause it, and you have to suffer through it, and it was not, that's not right. That's not fair. And you go through this. And then this context of suffering and future hope. But we need to understand a little bit about this guy who writes this passage on 1 Peter, because there's an idea of we all are, there's hard times that it's here. The hard times has its own purpose. Someone says to me, the actual study that we did for BYF was, you can imagine this, I said, we're going to do a study on spiritual growth. And the conversation on spiritual growth was, how do you go through suffering? Because you don't grow unless you have suffering. There's trials and things that go through that if you can push through and break through, that's when you find growth. Have you not found if you're able to get through a fight with a spouse and you can work through the breakthrough, you can get closer? If you can work through the breakthrough. And you must work through the breakthrough. Or when you go through having a heart-to-heart with your manager and you have that conversation and you have a work through the breakthrough. Or that moment where you and your kids, some of us who have teenage kids get this, you just didn't have that right conversation, and all of a sudden you have that right conversation because they're now adults, and you work through the breakthrough. And the relationship becomes strong when you understand them. They're not this person anymore, they're a new person. Just kind of give you a glimpse for some of you guys who will have that in your season. Or for you who are teenagers to have that heart-to-heart with your parents in the same way that I'm a little bit different. I'm not just the baby anymore. I've had those conversations with my parents. I don't know about you, but I remember I was trying to think about there are times where sometimes I'll share, but I realized, especially this week, that when I'm going through something, I tend not to share. Because I don't want anyone to worry. I feel like it's a burden. And over the last couple of years, few years with some of the leaders, they're like, I'll share a little bit more. But I don't share the rawness of the pain, the rawness of the suffering, the rawness of the worry, the rawness of the burden that has to be gone. And it could come from different places. I still remember a few years back, maybe 10 years ago, some of you guys may or may not know I have a disabled placard. I call it Blue Gold because it allows me to park anywhere for free in California in parking areas, okay? Someone's like, oh, some of you guys visitors, don't worry. Well, I can't say don't worry because I do use it for myself now, even today. But everyone's like, well, so I go, and then I park, and they're like, why do you have a handicap placard? You don't look like you need that. Okay, so full judgment. Okay, full judgment. Okay. It was only 10 years ago where I was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis, and it was at a camping trip where I really felt like I was exercising and working out. I was like doing some push-ups, kind of keeping there. Maybe my arms were so sore. But I realized Jenny and the kids had to carry all the stuff because they couldn't lift up my arms. So I remember that day we're in the tent, that camping trip, where Jenny had to put on my shirt, and my knees were hurting, and I was still trying to pretend to play wiffle ball while I was in pain, right? And I was like, and when I went to the doctor to find out that I had this thing, and they said it's for the rest of your life, I got my red gold, temporary placard, and then years later, like I got the blue gold. They just send it to you every year. Okay, once you're on the system, they just send it to you. I didn't tell them I don't need it, but you never know, because I was scared for last year, if you guys remember, right? But I remember like there were times where like when my son was so little and we would go to a mall and I was so achy, I was like, hey, can you give dad a piggyback ride? So he would just like piggyback me as I'm going through the thing because I'm just like sore as he's carrying me, like, for the way, because it's just so. And I just started thinking, like, there's just so much suffering. I don't think I ever get through this. Am I ever going to get out of this? Ever feel like that? Like, you're in a dark place. I'm going to be like this for the rest of my life? How am I supposed to do ministry? Okay, let me guess. This is the thorn thing that Paul had. I'm going to be like that. Like, you're justifying all these things in your mind to try to get through. And in the pain. And deep down, I was like, I don't know if I have the strength to do all the things I still need to go do. For the church, for the small group, for like all the things I still needed to go do, and for the work. How am I supposed to get through this? And with a blessing and it was just hard, but it was some things that came out, like family and the church community praying and supporting. Right now I can dance because of answered prayer. Like, to see that journey. And so I was taking meds. And it's meds that heal you, right? The meds will help dull the pain. And I don't know about this, but I never actually shared with you guys what happened because no one ever asked like what happened. They just saw me like kind of back to normal, kind of like last year. I'm like kind of back to normal. What happened was like for some reason one day I was still taking the meds and then like I don't know, like I stopped. Like you're supposed to talk to your doctor. Sorry, doctors, they're in the room. There's a bunch of physicians here in this room. But all of a sudden I decided like I'm not saying you should do this. I'm not setting an example. Okay? But I remember I stopped taking some of the meds and like it was fine. And somehow like I just started winding down like randomly. And like I don't have, and it's so funny because even today, I finally like a week ago, I had all these pill bottles that I've been saving just in case. I mean, they're kind of expired, but just in case, because they're expensive. And I was like, James, are you gonna throw those away? I'm like, no, like I don't know. And I took a picture of it. I don't know why, because it's like, you know how like you want to donate something? I took a picture of it and started reflecting on like, from that suffering to where it was at, like what do I, like that journey. And I started thinking about some of the other sufferings I've gone through. That's a physical one. Some of you guys are going through physical. There are pain and suffering of hard times, maybe emotional, maybe a broken relationship. Those are the ones that are heartfelt. When you have something that's been broken, a relationship, a friendship. Like I still remember a friendship I had all the way out through college, and all of a sudden something happened. It may have been my pride that broke that relationship, and then like a breaking of fellowship to a point where like it just pains me. And, those things you don't realize you carry with you. It gives you fear. Some of you guys have your own peace, but I just want to say like, and if you're going through a hard time right now, this context, like let's talk, like there's a journey, there is something for you that God wants to speak to you today. There's a guy who writes this. His name was Peter. But if you don't know Peter, I want to kind of make sure I introduce this guy to you who writes this passage. He was a fisherman. He was a fisherman. So he did a trade, fisherman. He had a brother. He was married. And he was a married guy who had like a family. And what he would do with his brother is go fish with a partner. His name is like his brother Andrew and a couple other guys, James and John. And there was 4 of them. These fishermen doing trade. And as you guys know, that wasn't the best job. The best job out there was like, rabbi, right? Teacher. That's like the highest form of like the best job. That's like, I don't know what the best job is today. Maybe a AI programmer. I don't know. You pick up like, what's the coolest job out there right now? I don't know. Okay. And I would just say, like, and for them, they were tradesmen. And then this is the same Peter that came forward, and even being the same Peter that was considered part of, he was also called the Rock. He met Jesus and called to follow him. He was the original Rock. Okay? So I've been watching a lot of WWE recently. I don't know why, okay? Okay? And basically, like, as Jesus calls him, he calls him, his name is Simon, actually. And he gives them this word, Cephas, or Kephas. Kephas is their Aramaic word, which means rock or Petra, or Peter. That's how we get the word Peter. And so you'll see his name as Cephas, or Kephas, Peter, or Simon Peter in the text. Okay? So anytime you see that, that's this guy. I call him, he's the original Rock. And the reason why he calls, like, the Rock, because he would be the foundation, like, they would say, like, he would build his church on these disciples, and he would be one that would be one of the leaders of the original church in Jerusalem. This is this Peter person. But this also Peter is the same person that also walked on water. When there was a storm, when there was drowning, kind of like a story ahead, when they're suffering. And all of a sudden, in the midst of suffering, he sees something amazing, so he's walking on water, and then when he sees what's going on, he begins to sink. Kind of like you may feel. You're like, I'm with God, and all of a sudden I see what's here, physically here, and I'm sinking, and I'm drowning. This is the same thing. The same Peter that all of a sudden after Jesus passed away, he jumped out of the water and realized it was Jesus and swam to the shore. This is this Peter, this Cephas. It's the same Peter that basically was the first one that said, who do people say I am? He was the first one to declare that you are the one that we've all been waiting for, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. We've been waiting. He declared boldly, kind of stating the obvious. Maybe they were all thinking it, but this guy's personality states the obvious. And he comes and writes this context. And he was also one of the ones of the inner circle. What I mean by inner circle is like there were the 12 apostles or disciples, and then there's 3 inner circles. It wasn't like they were like, maybe they were closer, but it's really the 3 that were always with them on different things. He saw Caiaphas' daughter resurrected from the dead. There wasn't all 12 of them there. Peter saw it. Peter was also one of the few ones that were there at Gethsemane, where Jesus explained and shared his suffering. You know that trial at Gethsemane, where right before before he was going to get captured and pulled in, he sends this person he's been walking for 3 years, share pain. Take this away from me, this Jesus character. And he was there, the one of the 3, seeing that suffering, seeing that in their Savior. The same Peter was also there as one of the few in the Transfiguration. When Jesus was raised from this is Peter, all his eyewitness, and he sees all this, and this is experience, and this flows into, obviously, the text that we're going to be reading about and studying for. It's also said that maybe in the Gospel of Mark, if you guys ever read in the Gospel of Mark, there is this context where maybe John Mark's Gospel was influenced by Peter himself. That in his entry, that you could see that Peter is mentioned frequently. Peter is kind of like the bookend. Peter is named as one of the church fathers. There's a description. And keep in mind, John Mark is the first of the 4 synoptic gospels. And so there's these verbal conversations that are going on. This is like a glimpse. And so what I challenge you, if you're like, what can I do during this time to augment a seriousness of your walk? If you're dealing with suffering, it's like, I challenge you, maybe read this Gospel of Mark. Read a little bit more in the Acts and see this Simon Peter, because this is the same Simon Peter that also denied Christ 3 times and dealt with rejection and broken relationship with Christ, where Christ also restores him in a redeemed relationship. Feel sounds familiar? So he's gone through the ups and the downs, some self-inflicted, some that happened to him. This is Peter, and he writes to us. He writes to a circular letter that's distributed around to the churches in Asia Minor. And this is the same Peter that ultimately would be as they describe, crucified for his faith by Nero in 64. After they blamed Christians, this is in context, they blamed Christians for starting the fire. And Christians were persecuted over and over again. And this is the context that he's writing this. And then he would he would die, but he wouldn't want to die like his Savior, so he would want to be crucified, the story goes. The tradition goes, is a better way, upside down. Hence, you see the cross upside down is St. Peter's cross, right? And you see it there, right? St. Peter's cross. So this is the Peter that understands I've gone through of that, this journey and this suffering. And so when we come to Peter in his story, you'll find a journey that's been taking. And and instead of giving you a 7-minute spiel that you can go ahead and look at the Bible Project and give you a good synopsis, and there's other resources that are there. I just want to highlight a few things. He writes this letter in this circular thing. He may not actually have written it because he wasn't educated. He was a fisherman. So if you look at the back of chapter 5, Silvanus probably penned it. So because there was a lot of argument whether he actually wrote this. But my view is that Silvanus writes it as he orally dictates this. And he describes the story. And it's kind of like his message. And he wants a circular letter to go around to encourage the Christians, both to these Jewish and Gentile. And remember, this is the same Peter that was only ministering to Jews, and he said, no, in Acts, where he says, there's a Gentile piece where you got a division, and you got to minister there. And so he's bringing forth a ministry to all Jews and Gentiles in Asia Minor, using profoundly this story of the Old Testament, of the exile that Israel is going, and bringing it forth and applying it to Gentiles, to us. So the story of Israel is our story. The story of your exile and your suffering, your brokenness, your loneliness, and everything is our story. We've been through that. It's a story, and that story of redemption and what that looks like, he brings that forth. This is the same Peter that at Pentecost did the sermon. You guys remember? This is the same guy, same fisherman. And so we find in this moment where, as this letter goes out, we get a glimpse of this idea of a story where you, like this first theme of this moment of you don't belong here. You are a sojourner. This is not where you belong. And if you who are going through suffering and persecution and going through the difficulty, if you thought that this is it, then it's going to suck. You're right. And anytime I get through my dark times, what got me through that ankle, yes, it was my family, yes, it was my friends, yes, it was our church community that prayed for me, but it was the fact that I had the hope that this is not it. You're like, what's the light at the end of the tunnel? Is the light at the end of the tunnel to get through this in this earth? Maybe. But there will be a day when all that pain, all that suffering, all that stuff is no more. And this time is but a glimpse. And you get some of that in Peter. You get some of that there is a macro view on time. Even in 2 Peter, like this, there's a bigger picture that's going on here. That you don't belong here. You're part of a new family identity, a new family unit. As a matter of fact, it's not only you have a new identity in Christ, but you have something you're part of something else. And in that, he gives you the beginnings of hope. And so if you are one of those people going through difficulty and you decide to isolate yourself, that's the one thing that the evil one, Satan, wants you to go do. Because if you do that, then you'll just fall into more traps. I'm going to hide myself. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to be on my phone. I'm not going to interact. I'm going to fall into my own trap. My favorite one is when I get a chance to talk to someone, especially like high school or college, when someone's broken up with a girlfriend or boyfriend, they'll share with me the story and they're ranting. Well, sorry, not the ranting. They're sharing in a passionate way. They were lamenting. I'll use the biblical term. They're lamenting, okay? As they lament, they're sharing, like, why this? What did I do? No. And like, I totally get it. And so of course, you're there. What do? You listen. You're present in the midst of suffering. But at the moment, if there is no place of encouraging them to think, like, if they get stuck there, the challenge is to be there, but to point them out. To say, like, close that chapter of your life and open up something new. But it's not something as easy as said and done. You're going to keep that's going to keep popping open. But if you stay there, that spiral continues to go. Share with you guys my story, my COVID story, where I was in my room isolated for like 2 weeks, and it was a dark place. Like after a while, you're just laying there. At first couple of weeks, you're like, I'm free. No kid. I mean, I don't know if you ever, you guys can admit it, although you laughed, admitted it right there. And so I was like, but then after a while, you're like, dude, man, like, no, FaceTime don't make it. It doesn't matter. I can go talk with people. It's just not the same. And I never had my mind go to places where I never thought it would go in that place of darkness, like being so isolated for that long. And some of you guys are introverts. You might have a longer runway to do that. But there is a point where you're like, God makes us to be a part of others. But as I was going through that journey, I'd say, you have to remind yourself, this is not where you belong. You have something else. There's something more that's ahead. You can't just settle on this piece, this world. And that's what Peter stands on. He says, if you only land at where you're at right now, then there's nothing else more. You need the context of a new family identity as a sojourner. And obviously, we'll talk more about that as we go through. There's a theme of there's hope in the midst of suffering. And that's like the main piece. In the midst of your persecution, in the midst of your suffering, I want to leave you with a context of hope. And that first one is that new family identity. But that hope that you have in the midst of suffering has purpose. And that purpose is the fact that you have the opportunity to come. In the fact that even as you as persecuted Christians, that you're as God's people, you might be misunderstood. That you live under a new king. And if you go ahead and live under this rule or live under the way things are, it would feels like there's no hope. Peter will highlight various things. He'll highlight the fact that he'll talk to those who are married to a spouse who in a context of patriarchy, where the husband is not a believer. How do you submit? How do you live in that context? How do you submit to a ruler like Nero? And how do you support that? That's all in this. Or you have a bad ruler. And how do you live out God's generous love? But you need to come in the context, you have a new ruler that you follow, a new king that you rule, that you follow, that you're under their rule. That's where hope can come from. Because if it comes from here now, how much have people have hope in this current state of our world today? There's fear. But you have to there's fear, there's worry, there's pain, there's suffering, there's dichotomy, there's division, there's polarization. And then where's the hope? Do we rely on rulers and governments and all that to make it well? And in this context, they couldn't. As a matter of fact, for their faith, they were being persecuted for that. How do you still honor? Then they said, for the one who happens to be both are believers, both the husband and the wife. There's different contexts where it's like, hey, you both have to share a generous love. It's a new expectation of how you're supposed to live. It's a new rule that you rule under. But I would say that even under this rule, there's a reality. There's a reality of this idea of darkness. There's a spirit of darkness that goes forward, and Peter describes this in this context. There's dark forces that even though you may not realize, we're supposed to demonstrate God's generous love in the context, but there's dark forces that continue to come forward. Right now, even today, I don't know if you're aware, but there's 360 million Christians that are persecuted for their faith. Open Doors has this. If you guys ever want, I support this. This is a ministry I've supported since college. And about, because there's a calling for us as believers to pray for those who are persecuted, a persecuted church. And I didn't have time, but I have 50 copies of this map in books, and you guys have it. We'll upload it. We'll put it on the website. You guys can download it, and you can find it yourself. But in the context of the brothers and sisters, the reason why it's so powerful is that when you're going through suffering, when you're going through persecution, it's a purifying fire. Because you begin to see what are the things that are important and what the things are not important. And Peter describes this. And you'll find that it's only through, like, when you go through this thing, when I was going through my health issue, my ankylosing spondylitis, I'm like, I got to figure out what is important. Like, I obviously can only do so much. So what are the things that matter and what things don't matter? And you start, like, purifying force of what that might be. And in the context of the body of believers, in your walk with him, there's certain things that you should do or shouldn't do. Okay. And so God kind of leaves us with this piece. There is this generous love that happens when we're going through difficulty and suffering. When we're going through persecution, there is a calling for us to demonstrate Jesus' generous love in the difficult suffering place we're at. Whoever we're at. And I thought that was profound because usually when you're going through suffering, you don't have any capacity to give. But for Peter, what he is describing is that it's not something that comes from you, but in the midst of your suffering, God can work through you. And that when you start turning your attention not from yourself, like the broken up relationship, and you start turning your attention to others, God brings a redemptive healing that happens. That in the midst of persecution from a government, or in the midst of persecution of a thing, or the midst of a broken relationship, that you start providing a generosity of your love. God begins to transform you in that process. Well, let me explain. Well, there is a passage here. It says, there is this, where many of us, it says, you're a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, just a brand new identity, new family unit. But I always never really highlighted this. Once you were not a people, but you are now a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but you have received mercy. But do you know where this comes from? Do you understand the context of the profoundness of this as Peter? Remember, Peter is bringing forth this context of Old Testament, or this Old Testament journey, this journey of Israel, and applying to us, or to the Gentiles, for us today. And he takes this one in particular, says, you are a new people, a new family identity, and he brings forth a profound thought. So now open your Bible and turn to Hosea. Hosea chapter 2. And in the prophet Hosea, you get this story of Hosea and Gomer. Okay? And if you have your Bible, I want you to kind of flip through with me the story of Hosea, and I encourage you to spend some time on it on your own, because it allows for you to put a little bit of context of at least today's what I call trailer, okay? Introduction. Chapter 1, verse 1, it says, Hosea, the word of the Lord, in Hosea, the word of the Lord, which was revealed to Hosea and the son, he says, verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, he said to him, go and marry a prostitute who will bear illegitimate children, conceived through prostitution, because the nations continually commit spiritual prostitution by turning away from the Lord. And so Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Dublin, and she conceived and gave birth a son for him. And the Lord said to Hosea, name him Jezreel, because it is in a little while I will punish the dynasty of Jehu and account of bloodshed of the valley of Jezreel. Okay, and I'm going to destroy them. Verse 6, she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and the Lord said to him, name her No Pity, because I will no longer have any pity for the nation of Israel. For I will certainly not forgive their guilt, but I will have pity on the nation of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God. I will deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by the warrior's bow or sword or military victory, or by chariot horses, or by chariots. And then when she had weaned No Pity, she conceived again. Here we go, another one, and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Not My People, Lo Ami, because you are not my people and I am not your God. And it goes on, it says, however, in the future, the number of people of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. There's like a moment of promise. Although it was said to them, you are not my people, and I will say to them, you are not my children, the living God, then the people of Judah and the people of Israel will gather together, and they will be pumped for themselves one leader, or flourish the land. Then you will be called brother, my people, and you will be called sister, Pity. So you have this illustration. I'll come back to this. Hosea, a prophet. Imagine if this is your, like, how do I want me to serve you, God? Okay, this is how I want you to serve me. Go find a prostitute and go marry them. And as a matter of fact, go have children, but they're not your children. And then name them this. Is that like the calling that you want? Okay, thank you. Only one person said, no way, Josh. Thank you. That was honest. That's very good. Okay? But yet, that was this journey and story, this prophet's calling and journey. Go marry a prostitute, and you're like, why? And then he goes through this story, and there is this profound conversation throughout, like, how God's going to discipline. But let me go to chapter 3, and I'll come back to chapter 2. In chapter 3, the Lord said to me, go show love to your wife again. So he goes off and he judges, even though she loves another man. Oh, jeez. And continually commits adultery. Likewise, the Lord loves Israel, although they turn to other gods and love to offer raisin cakes to idols. So I paid 15 shekels of silver, about 17 bushels of barley, to purchase her. And I told her, you must live with me many days. You must not commit adultery or have sexual intercourse with another man, and I will wait for you. And for the Israelites must live many days without a king or a prince, without sacrifice or fertility. Afterwards, Israel will turn back and seek the Lord their God and their Davidic king, and they will submit to the Lord in fear and receive their blessing. The word of the Lord. But it comes in the context of a couple other things. In chapter 2, you have this like profound things going on. So you have this illustrative calling of Hosea and Gomer, where he goes, this, like, not only does he conceive kids, but he goes and he says, love this, like Gomer, like how I might love Israel, go and buy them back. As a matter of fact, later on, chapter 2, he says, go and send them gifts. And say it's from the prostitute, from the person he's committing adultery with. This is the God, this is the love that I show. This amazing, illustrative chesed love. Loyal. Kindness that's, like, this is kindness like you can't understand this loving kindness. Like, a kindness that's such loving that you would go to that level where it's completely undeserved, and yet to receive that. In the midst of that suffering, in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that mistake, in the midst of that selfish, in the midst of that, this is the God that we know. Now, but yet it is illustrated in chapter 2, verse 23. Okay? And in 2:23, at the end of the story, again, we can't have time to go through all of it, it says, I will plant her as my own in the land. So despite I'm going to go give these wonderful gifts to Israel, and it was like, even though they think it's from the guy, it's actually from me, the husband, God says. That's how much I love. I want this Gomer or this person to feel that love. I want Israel to feel that love, even though I'm blessing them through another person. That's how the profoundness of what's going on. And at the end, I will plant her as my own in the land. I will have I will have pity on no pity. I will say, not my people, you are my people. And I will say, you are my God. That's what he's referring to. He takes the same story, Peter does, and says, even though they were not my people, you are my people. Even though you're not my God, you are my God. Even though you don't deserve it, you are now giving mercy. And here, he takes this profound thought, and in the most illustrated, this is one panel of a new way, a new calling, a new identity, a new suffering, right? In the midst of the types of suffering, let me give you a new story. In the midst of all this. So I can only give you one of this, because again, we're going through this whole year. But I want to point a trailer. In the context of Hosea, you find generous love, is all my point. And that generous love leads to like a hope. Without that generous love to be received, it's hard to have hope. To keep going. A generous love that doesn't come from you, it comes from God, that loves you so kindly, that gives you the fact to keep going in that hope. That even if my physical ailment does not get weigh itself, that I will keep going because I've been loved, I've been accepted, I just got to do what I got to do in the season I'm at because I have a hope that is to come. Even when there's brokenness in my life and things are not whole, that God's going to make his way to go make those things whole in the best way. But there'll still be the pieces of scars. but I'll function, I'll keep going. And if there's anyone here that feels like that you are stuck, that you are reminded of this generous, greater love, that you were not a people, but now you're a people. If you're feeling like you're in persecution or suffering, you are part of a people, a part of a community, a part of a God that has generous love for you, that calls us to generous love for one another. And so that gives you the ability to endure. So when I said it's beyond enduring, I actually mean that, yes, at the end of the day, the heart of perseverance, the heart of the faith that we have, that our faithfulness requires a lot of endurance. How do you keep going? How do you wake up each day? How do you keep enduring in the midst of difficulty? Think about it. If they were persecuted for their faith, what were they supposed to do? If they were married to a really bad patriarchal husband, it's described, what are you supposed to do? If the slaves are getting beaten for something, and they become believers, how do they continue to live out their faith in that context? Is what Peter's dealing with in this passage. How do they deal with a government that does not believe in, does not honoring him, as not as persecuting anti-them? How do you use them and say, this is the context they're at? And for us, we live in a world that we place our faith, we may be placing our faith in the wrong things. We need to place our faith in the God, the generous, loving God that has that great purpose and plan to give us enduring hope. So, how do we last beyond? First of all, the reality is there are dark forces that are out there. I described this idea where it's like there are, in the panels in 1 Peter, there's all these kind of different things he's dealing with. But at the end of the day, the best way to describe it is there's these forces. And I think it translates to us today. There are dark voices and dark forces. Those voices that want you to just give up. Those voices that want you to stay broken. Those voices that want you to judge. Those are voices. Those voices of hate. You're like, oh, hate's not okay. Hate is literally, I'll say this, it's really from the devil. So if you get to that place, you're taking the source from the wrong spot. Contrast with love. Even though there's a right, think of Hosea. Hosea had the right to genuinely be bitter and hate. And yet, he had to demonstrate this crazy loving kindness in the context of Gomer. This is the dark forces contrasted with light forces. And that we are to be that light as sojourners, Peter will say, that can witness the light in a dark place. That we are to be that, we must resist through our faithfulness in the midst of our times. How faithful are we to him? And that we find hope in the fact that we don't belong here, that there is a hope that is to come. It's beyond just holding your breath. There's a point where somehow, I may sound strange, but you may be able to breathe underwater. It's that same idea of how in the world could you touch the sky? I always wondered the song, right? That we always sing it. When you say, I surrender, I give you all. And I think for some of us here, let me get back to the heart. In the midst of difficulty and suffering, it's time to surrender. It's time to say, I will surrender the dark voices. I will surrender the dark forces. I will surrender the greed. I'll surrender the pride. I'll surrender the brokenness. I'll surrender my temptation. I'll surrender. I'm going to lay those down, and I'm going to put those before you to find your love, your freedom, your hope again. I don't know about you guys. Some of us are stuck, and the only time you get to that is when things are fully broken, but you come back to his hope again. And I hope that you, for some of us here, who are going through difficulty, come back to the spot and lay those down to the point where you can breathe underwater again. You could touch the sky and fly like wings like eagles. These crazy thoughts. When people say, well, if you go through difficulty, you just get there. No. That's not how it works when you go through suffering. And so what I ask you to do right now is I want you to just take a moment and we're going to respond to God. Close your eyes. And we're going to do this together as a community. Okay? We come to you, God, in the prophet Hosea, that for many of us here, we've dealt with a sense of pain, of suffering. We don't have a lot of this there's darkness, there's difficulty. It was very difficult to try to figure out what exactly, like, I sense a overwhelming presence of survival. I sense a presence of some places emptiness. I sense a place where some of us are wanting more. Some of us here are also kind of coming out of brokenness or feeling like we're still a little bit shattered on certain areas. The lack of willing to trust. I feel that. Some of us are dealing with physical brokenness. Some of us are dealing with a relational or emotional. But God, our God, we want to surrender. Some of us are still relying and staying in our past. Some of us are stuck in our brain, not experiencing the heart of your love. And God, I just pray right now that you would somehow soften the hearts of our brothers and sisters here. Help the gaze of their soul to be able to see more clearly now than this like fogginess of lies and to rely in that suffering and that pain and that grave and that brokenness and that shame and that fear. Help them to be able to find newness of life, a hope again, a love again. God, it's been a tough week for me, a couple weeks for me. I know my brothers and me have gone through a tough week. And I genuinely believe that we need one another. So would you help us to be more open to each other? I pray that right now, if we know of someone who's suffering, that we could pray for them right now. Just guys, pray for that person right now. If you're that person that feels like you're in the midst of suffering, I pray that you would learn to surrender. And I want you to use the actual words, I surrender. Some of you need the place of confession, and you say, I confess. But don't let your brain wander. Let your words be there to speak. And as you guys continue to just pray, let the worship leader lead you, and just respond. Some of you guys will just stay there, remain in silent prayer and surrender. Continue to name other things you need to surrender. Maybe there's certain people in your life that you need to pray for. Maybe there's certain things you need to pray for. Maybe there's certain people you need to pray for. Maybe you're holding on to a burden of a parent or a kid or a certain thing that you're trying to control. You got to let go of that control. I don't know what it is that's you're suffering through right now, but let God speak to you. And experience the acceptance of God again. Not my people, you are his people. Not your God, you are his God. And get back to that story. I also challenge you right now to show up. I feel convicted. Some of you are showing up, but you're showing up half-heartedly. You're showing up because you think, some of you guys don't show up because you think you're better than. Some of you are showing up because you don't have time for it. But people, like in the context of showing up, it means to be there for someone, for another person, for brother and sister, or for your family. Maybe it's showing up in your other, not necessarily here, but like someplace. Maybe it's a text you need to send. Maybe it's a sorry you need to have. Maybe it's a hug you need to give. Continue this time of praying. If you feel comfortable, feel ready, go ahead and just, for the next 2 songs, we're just going to continue this open time of silent prayer, response, surrender. And then when you feel, I want you to end your prayer with confessing and making a confession of faith to God again. And if you're willing to make that confession of faith, to pledge our allegiance to the wonderful King that loves you, accepts you, like Hosea and Gomer does to Gomer, I invite you to come and receive the Lord's Supper again and experience that love, experience that presence, and carry that forth of generous love and as a witness to those around. So we'll go ahead and just invite you to pray, and then when you come take the communion on your own, let this whole time be a response to God, and just receive it. I'll just, when the deacons are ready, you can come up at your own leisure, and when you're ready to just respond to the song, and we'll have both the response and communion together.
Jesus Christ.